By the late summer of 1944, the war in Western Europe no longer looked like a fight for survival. Germany was losing. Not gradually, not ambiguously. It was collapsing. Entire formations surrendered without resistance. Cities fell without prolonged fighting. Supply lines held because there was no one left capable of cutting them. For many Allied commanders, the question had already shifted. It was no longer whether Germany would be defeated. It was how the end would be arranged. From the outside, this looked like success. From inside Allied headquarters, it felt like control. Nothing suggested imminent danger. There was no looming German counteroffensive, no sign of strategic recovery, no evidence the enemy could regain operational coherence. Casualty rates were dropping, advances were accelerating. This was what modern war was supposed to look like. And no one embodied that reality more completely than George S. Patton. Patton's armies didn't advance, they flowed. Columns moved day and night, often outrunning their own supply projections. Distances that once took weeks were crossed in days. German rear areas dissolved before resistance could even form. The faster Patton moved, the more German command structures fractured. Orders arrived too late. Units retreated into empty space. Surrender became routine. From a purely military perspective, the logic felt undeniable. Speed shortened the war. Speed reduced casualties. Speed denied the enemy time to adapt. Every mile gained compressed Germany's ability to manage its own defeat. Administrative control collapsed alongside military resistance. The German state could no longer decide how, where, or under what conditions surrender would occur. That mattered, because wars are not only ended by battles. They are ended by decisions made under pressure, and speed removes the enemy's ability to make them. For frontline commanders, the picture looked clean. The enemy was beaten. Momentum favored the Allies. Advancing faster simply made sense. What was not yet visible was that speed had begun intersecting with limits that were not military in nature. These limits didn't announce themselves with artillery. They didn't appear as supply collapses or battlefield reversals. They existed above the front lines, in agreements signed months earlier, in diplomatic understandings never tested under conditions of rapid collapse. Patton's speed did not threaten German forces alone. It threatened timing. And timing in coalition warfare is power. At this stage of the war, Allied unity mattered as much as battlefield success. The coalition held together because events unfolded slowly enough for diplomacy to keep pace. Patton changed that balance. His advances compressed time. And when time compresses, decisions are forced. The danger was not that Patton was reckless. The danger was that he was effective. Effective in a way that exposed unresolved questions. Questions about occupation. Questions about authority. Questions about where armies would physically stand when the war ended and what that would mean afterward. None of this felt urgent yet. There were no alarms. No emergency conferences triggered by crisis. No visible price for moving fast. That's why the moment was so deceptive. Victory felt inevitable. The end felt secure. But inevitability hides consequence. And speed, once unleashed, does not only end wars. It decides what follows them. At this point, no one believed Patton himself was a problem. That realization would come later, when speed stopped being a solution and started becoming a liability. If Patton represented speed, Eisenhower represented containment. This difference was not personal, it was structural. They were not trying to win the same kind of war. By late 1944, Dwight D. Eisenhower was no longer thinking like a field commander chasing tactical advantage. He was thinking like a coalition manager overseeing the final phase of a global conflict. His responsibility extended far beyond the destruction of German armies. It included the preservation of an alliance already straining under the weight of success. Eisenhower understood something Patton never fully accepted. The war was already won, but the peace was not. For Eisenhower, the most dangerous phase of any coalition war is not the opening, when enemies are strong and unity is obvious. It is the closing phase, the moment victory feels inevitable and interests begin to diverge. The closer the Allies moved toward Germany's collapse, the more exposed their internal contradictions became. Patton's advance did not just pressure German defenses, it pressured Allied agreements. Those agreements had been negotiated months earlier under very different assumptions. They assumed a slow end to the war. They assumed resistance would grind forward. They assumed diplomacy would have time to keep pace with battlefield reality. Patton destroyed those assumptions. Every unexpected breakthrough shortened timelines diplomats relied on. Every mile gained forced decisions leaders had postponed. Where would armies stop? Who would occupy what? Who would administer Germany when the fighting ended? These were not academic questions, they were existential ones, and the answers would shape Europe for decades. Eisenhower's authority did not come from battlefield brilliance. It came from trust. Trust from Washington, trust from London, and critically, trust from Moscow. That trust was fragile. It existed because Eisenhower had proven himself predictable, disciplined, and loyal to the agreements holding the coalition together. Patton was none of those things. Not because he was reckless, but because unpredictability was his weapon. From Eisenhower's perspective, Patton's genius came with a cost. His success threatened to destabilize the framework, allowing the war to end cleanly. Not because Patton was wrong tactically, but because tactical brilliance does not guarantee strategic stability. This was the core tension between them. Patton believed wars were won by exploiting momentum until collapse was absolute. Eisenhower believed wars were ended by controlling momentum once collapse became inevitable. These are fundamentally different philosophies. Patton saw hesitation as failure. Eisenhower saw restraint as responsibility. As Allied armies pushed deeper into Europe, Eisenhower's priorities shifted. Away from speed, toward control. Not control over German territory, but control over Allied behavior. That distinction mattered more than Patton realized, because once armies occupy cities, rivers, and capitals, they gain leverage no conference table can erase. Physical presence matters more than intent, and Patton's speed threatened to create irreversible facts before Allied leadership was ready to manage them. This is why Eisenhower's war became one of boundaries. Boundaries on advances, boundaries on ambition, boundaries on initiative. Not because he doubted Patton's ability, but because he understood its implications. From Patton's perspective, this looked like timidity. From Eisenhower's perspective, it was containment. He was not trying to stop Patton from winning, he was trying to stop the alliance from fracturing at the moment of victory. Patton was still fighting Germany. Eisenhower was already managing the world that would exist after Germany fell. And those two objectives were no longer aligned. Speed is not just a military advantage, it is a political force. And by late 1944, Patton's speed had begun to create realities no diplomatic agreement could easily reverse. Every map drawn in London or Washington assumed one thing above all else: time. Time for negotiations, time for coordination, time for control. Patton removed time from the equation. His advances did not simply outpace German defenses, they outpaced Allied planning. Cities were liberated before occupation plans were finalized. Rail hubs fell before administrative chains were established. German formations surrendered faster than directives could be issued about who would accept them and under whose authority. This was not chaos, it was efficiency. And efficiency at this scale was dangerous. Because when armies arrive first, they shape outcomes. They control roads, they control communications, they control perception. And once an army occupies territory, no promise made at a conference table can fully negate its influence. Eisenhower understood this. He had watched it happen before. In Italy, in North Africa, even within Allied ranks where overlapping commands created friction simply by being present. Patton's spearheads were not just advancing, they were preempting decisions. The faster Patton moved, the fewer choices remained. If American forces reached certain objectives first, questions would arise that Eisenhower was not authorized to answer alone. Questions like, who governs this area? Which army supplies it? Which political authority claims it after surrender? These were not battlefield issues. They were post-war problems arriving early. Diplomacy works best when events unfold predictably. Patton made the war unpredictable again. And unpredictability, even when successful, creates instability. To Patton, this was victory doing what victory should do, collapsing resistance faster than expected. To Eisenhower, it was victory forcing decisions before consensus existed. The alliance had survived because events moved slowly enough for compromise to keep up. Patton reversed that relationship. He made compromise chase events. And when diplomacy chases events, it loses leverage. Eisenhower was acutely aware of this imbalance. The Soviet Union was watching Allied advances carefully. Not just how far they went, but how fast. Speed signaled intent. Speed suggested ambition. Speed implied a willingness to shape Europe unilaterally. Whether that was true or not did not matter. Perception mattered more. Patton's speed complicated everything. It complicated Allied messaging. It complicated trust. It complicated post-war boundaries that had been agreed upon only in principle, not in practice. Every unexpected breakthrough risked turning a military success into a diplomatic crisis. And Eisenhower could not afford a crisis. Not now. Not when Germany's collapse was imminent. Not when unity mattered more than momentum. Patton believed facts on the ground would force better outcomes. Eisenhower feared those facts would fracture the alliance before peace could be secured. This was not cowardice. It was calculation. Eisenhower had one overriding priority: end the war together. Not fastest, not boldest, not most decisively. Together. And that meant slowing the man who was winning too fast. By the autumn of 1944, the most important line in Europe was not drawn on any battlefield map. It did not follow rivers. It did not follow mountain ranges, and it was not defended by German divisions. It existed only on paper and in agreement. This was the invisible line, the boundary between Allied advance and post-war reality. At conferences like Tehran and later Yalta, Allied leaders had sketched broad understandings about occupation zones, not precise borders, not operational details, just assumptions. Assumptions built on one fragile belief: that the war would end slowly enough for politics to catch up. Patton threatened that belief. Every mile his tanks advanced increased the chance that American forces would physically occupy territory never intended to be held by them. Once that happened, retreat would become a political decision, not a military one. And political retreats are far harder than tactical withdrawals. Eisenhower knew this. He also knew something Patton did not fully appreciate. Once American soldiers occupied a city, the question would no longer be whether they could leave. It would be whether they should. And that question would not be answered by generals. It would be answered by presidents. And presidents do not like being forced into choices by battlefield momentum. This is why Eisenhower's orders began to change, not dramatically, not publicly, but subtly. Objectives became secondary. Advances became conditional. Momentum became something to be managed, not exploited. Patton felt it immediately. His orders arrived later. His latitude narrowed. His operational freedom tightened. To Patton, this felt like betrayal. To Eisenhower, it was containment. The invisible line mattered because of what came next. Germany was not the final problem. Germany was the transition. The real test would be how Europe was shaped after surrender. Who occupied which cities? Who controlled which roads? Who administered which populations? These facts would define power long after the shooting stopped. And Patton's speed threatened to answer those questions unilaterally. That could not be allowed. Not because Patton was wrong, but because unilateral outcomes would fracture the alliance faster than any German counterattack ever could. Eisenhower had seen alliances collapse before. He had studied them. They rarely fail under pressure. They fail under success. When victory exposes differences that had been hidden by necessity. Patton did not see invisible lines. He saw opportunities, open roads, disintegrating resistance, an enemy retreating faster than pursuit plans could be written. To him, stopping made no sense. Every hour lost was a gift to the enemy. But Eisenhower was no longer fighting the enemy Patton saw. He was fighting the enemy Patton could not see. Mistrust, misalignment, and the quiet collapse of unity that follows unrestrained momentum. The line Patton approached was never meant to be crossed. Not because it was forbidden, but because crossing it would change the war into something no general could control. And Eisenhower understood that once crossed, there would be no clean way back. By late 1944, Patton's problem was no longer the German army. It was distance. His forces were moving so fast that geography itself became hostile. Roads clogged with wreckage. Bridges blown behind retreating Germans, rail lines destroyed faster than engineers could repair them. And fuel. Always fuel. Patton's Third Army consumed gasoline at a rate planners had never modeled. Thousands of vehicles, hundreds of miles, entire divisions dependent on a supply system never designed for continuous pursuit. At first, logistics bent to will. Red Ball Express convoys ran day and night. Drivers slept beside their trucks. Engines ran until they failed. Momentum fed momentum. But speed is expensive. Every mile forward stretched the supply chain thinner, and Eisenhower saw something dangerous forming. If Patton outran logistics, he wouldn't just stall. He would force decisions, emergency reallocations, supply favoritism, public explanations, each one a crack in alliance cohesion. Montgomery watched closely. So did Bradley. Every gallon diverted to Patton was a gallon not moving elsewhere. Every bridge prioritized for Third Army delayed another front. Patton didn't care. He believed success justified imbalance. Eisenhower did not share that belief. From Eisenhower's perspective, speed without balance was instability. The war was no longer about who advanced fastest. It was about who arrived at the end intact, politically, logistically, and diplomatically. And Patton was arriving too fast. This is when speed stopped being admired and started being feared. Not by the Germans, by the Allies. Orders became tighter, fuel allocations were capped, objectives were reframed, priorities were adjusted. Patton felt the slowdown like a physical restraint. He had broken through German lines repeatedly. Now he was breaking against invisible resistance. Paper, protocol, permission. To Patton, this felt like sabotage. To Eisenhower, it was stabilization. The faster Patton moved, the more control Eisenhower needed to exert. Because uncontrolled speed doesn't just win wars, it creates facts. And facts are permanent. Once American tanks sat in a city, no conference could erase that reality. Once flags were raised, lowering them became a political act. Eisenhower understood that speed had begun to write history faster than diplomacy could keep up, and that terrified him more than any German counterattack. The irony was brutal. Patton was doing exactly what armies are trained to do: exploit collapse, maintain pressure, never let the enemy recover. But the war had shifted beneath his feet. The enemy was no longer Germany alone. It was time. And time was now the most dangerous variable on the battlefield. By early September 1944, Eisenhower faced a problem no Allied commander had prepared for. The German army was collapsing faster than the alliance could manage the consequences. Entire regions were falling without coordinated resistance. German units surrendered by the thousands. Command structures disintegrated faster than intelligence could track. And at the center of it all was Patton. Patton wasn't asking permission anymore. He was reporting outcomes. Cities taken, crossings forced, distances covered that planners said were impossible. Each success reduced Eisenhower's room to maneuver, because every mile Patton advanced narrowed the space for diplomatic coordination. Eisenhower understood something Patton refused to consider. Wars do not end when armies collapse. They end when allies agree on what replaces them. And that agreement did not yet exist. Occupation zones had been negotiated months earlier, on paper. They assumed a gradual advance. They assumed resistance. They assumed time. Patton was destroying those assumptions. If American forces crossed certain lines too quickly, there would be no clean way to pull them back. No explanation that wouldn't look like weakness. No justification that wouldn't anger someone. The Soviets were watching. The British were watching. So was Washington. Speed had begun to corner Eisenhower. If he let Patton continue unrestricted, the alliance would fracture. If he stopped Patton, he would have to explain why momentum was being sacrificed without a battlefield cause. There was no good option, only controlled damage. So Eisenhower chose management over momentum. Fuel allocations were redistributed. Supply priorities were balanced. Objectives were clarified and quietly limited. No dramatic announcement, no formal halt order. Just enough resistance to slow the flow. Patton noticed immediately. Requests that once took hours now took days. Convoys were rerouted. Bridges were unavailable. Weather delays suddenly mattered again. To Patton, this wasn't caution, it was betrayal. He had done everything doctrine demanded: exploit the breach, maintain tempo, deny recovery. And now his own side was imposing friction. Eisenhower justified it differently. He wasn't stopping Patton, he was preserving the alliance. Because the real danger wasn't losing the war, it was winning it in a way that made peace impossible to manage. That was the moment Eisenhower crossed a line of his own. He accepted that military efficiency could no longer be the highest priority. From that point forward, the war would be slowed deliberately, not to save German lives, but to save Allied unity. And once that decision was made, Patton's greatest enemy was no longer on the battlefield. It was the man signing the orders. From the outside, nothing looked wrong. The front lines were moving. German resistance continued to collapse. Maps filled with arrows pointing east. Victory still looked inevitable. But beneath the surface, Eisenhower saw something unraveling. Patton's speed wasn't just advancing the front, it was collapsing decision windows. Every rapid breakthrough shortened the time available for coordination between governments that did not trust each other completely. The British worried about marginalization. Montgomery's carefully planned operations looked slow by comparison. Prestige mattered. So did perception. An American general racing across Europe made British caution look like incompetence. That tension had political consequences back home. Churchill could not afford a narrative where British forces appeared secondary in the final victory. Not after years of sacrifice. Not with an empire already weakening. Patton's momentum threatened more than German lines. It threatened Allied balance. Then there was the Soviet question. Stalin had agreed to occupation zones based on timelines that assumed resistance. Patton was rewriting those timelines in real time. If American forces reached areas earmarked for Soviet occupation, someone would have to explain why they were there. Explanations are not neutral. They imply intent. They imply advantage. They imply betrayal. Eisenhower understood this instinctively. Speed was beginning to create facts no conference could undo. Once a city is taken, it becomes a symbol. Once soldiers settle in, withdrawal looks like surrender. Once flags are raised, lowering them becomes political theater. Patton didn't think in those terms. He thought in miles. And that difference mattered. Eisenhower wasn't afraid of Patton failing. He was afraid of Patton succeeding too decisively. Because total victory without coordination leads to fractured peace. History had already taught that lesson. The last war had ended with unresolved bitterness. This one could not afford the same mistake. So Eisenhower doubled down on control. Not openly, quietly. Supply ceilings hardened. Operational flexibility narrowed. Strategic patience replaced tactical brilliance. Patton felt the leash tighten. His army was still moving, but no longer freely. Every success now required negotiation. Every advance came with invisible resistance. He had not lost the war. He had lost autonomy. And that loss would define the rest of his campaign. Because from this point forward, Patton was no longer racing Germany. He was racing time. while being slowed by the very alliance he was fighting for. Patton felt it before he could prove it. Orders still came through, maps still updated, but something had changed. Requests that once took hours now took days. Fuel allocations arrived trimmed. Ammunition priorities quietly shifted elsewhere. Nothing dramatic, nothing you could point to and accuse. Just enough friction to slow momentum. For a commander who lived on speed, friction was poison. Patton's doctrine depended on tempo, on moving faster than the enemy could think, faster than they could regroup, faster than they could even understand what was happening. Slow him down, and you changed the nature of the war he was fighting. To Patton, this felt irrational. German resistance was collapsing. Prisoners poured in. Entire units surrendered to scouts and rear guards. The road ahead was open, and yet he was being told to wait. Wait for coordination. Wait for approvals. Wait for the broader picture. Patton hated abstractions. He believed wars were won by concrete actions, not diplomatic patience. In his mind, every pause gave Germany breathing room. Every delay allowed order to reassert itself where chaos should have ruled. And every mile not taken today would cost lives tomorrow. That belief was not arrogance, it was experience. But Eisenhower's experience told a different story. He had spent years managing personalities as much as armies. British commanders, American politicians, Soviet expectations. Patton was a weapon, a powerful one. But weapons without restraint could destroy alliances as easily as enemies. The irony was brutal. Patton was being restrained not because he was reckless, but because he was right too often. Every success validated his argument, and every validation made the political problem worse. By late summer, the contradiction was impossible to ignore. Patton could break through, but he could not be allowed to decide what happened afterward. His victories created questions no one wanted to answer yet. Who would occupy what? Who would govern whom? Who would claim credit when the war ended? Wars are not just about defeating enemies. They are about deciding futures. And Patton was accelerating history faster than the alliance could control it. So the leash remained. Invisible. Plausible. Effective. Patton still advanced, but no longer at the speed of collapse, only at the speed permitted. And that distinction would haunt the final phase of the war, because when momentum is slowed deliberately, it does not disappear. It builds pressure, and pressure eventually demands release. By early September 1944, the contradiction had hardened into policy. Patton's Third Army was still moving, but it was no longer being allowed to decide the direction of the war. Fuel was the clearest signal. Gasoline was no longer distributed to whoever advanced fastest. It was allocated according to priorities set far from the front lines. Patton's requests were approved, just not fully. Enough to keep him moving, not enough to let him break the system. To Eisenhower, this was balance. To Patton, it was sabotage. He was not being stopped by German resistance. He was being slowed by American restraint. That distinction mattered, because it meant the war was no longer being shaped by battlefield reality, but by political timing. Eisenhower understood something Patton refused to accept. Speed had begun to outrun diplomacy. The faster Patton advanced, the closer Allied armies came to lines that had already been agreed upon, lines drawn on maps long before victory was certain. Occupation zones, command authorities, post-war control. These were not theoretical. They were promises. And promises between allies were fragile things. Breaking them, even accidentally, risked something worse than delay. It risked fracture. Patton saw empty roads. Eisenhower saw future borders. Patton saw defeated Germans. Eisenhower saw Soviet expectations. Neither man was wrong. They were fighting different wars. And Eisenhower's war was larger. As Patton's columns pressed east, the alliance tightened its grip. Requests required justification. Advances required coordination. Initiative required permission. The very qualities that had made Patton unstoppable, speed, autonomy, aggression, were now liabilities. In staff meetings, the language changed. No longer exploit success, but maintain balance. No longer advance wherever resistance collapses, but advance where it aligns. Aligns with what? Not the enemy, with the alliance. Patton had become too powerful to ignore and too disruptive to unleash. The tragedy was subtle. No public confrontation, no dramatic dismissal, no official rebuke, just constraint, quiet, systematic, effective. Patton continued to fight brilliantly, but brilliance no longer translated into freedom. This was the moment the war's outcome stopped being decided by generals and started being decided by administrators. The battlefield had done its work. Now history was being arranged. And Patton, the fastest blade the Allies possessed, was being sheathed while still sharp. By the fall of 1944, the shape of the war had changed. Not in the maps, in the decisions. Patton was still winning battles, still breaking German formations, still advancing whenever fuel allowed. But the outcome was no longer his to determine. The enemy was no longer Germany. It was timing. Every decision now had to answer a question no one wanted to ask out loud. What happens after we win? Patton did not care about after. He believed war should end decisively, violently, and without ambiguity. Victory in his mind was something you took, not something you negotiated. But Eisenhower understood that the moment Germany collapsed, the alliance would be tested harder than it ever had been during combat. British interests, American politics, Soviet ambitions, all waiting behind the front line. And Patton was sprinting straight toward them. Every mile he advanced narrowed the space for diplomacy. Every German unit destroyed by Patton's speed removed leverage from future talks. Every city taken by American armor raised the same unspoken question: who controls it when the shooting stops? That was not Patton's concern. It was Eisenhower's responsibility. So Patton was slowed, not openly, not dishonorably, but decisively. Fuel was redirected. Supplies were reprioritized. Other fronts were elevated. The system adjusted itself to neutralize excess speed. Patton felt it. He wrote about it. He complained about it. He warned that stopping momentum would cost lives. He was not wrong, but he was also not in charge of the peace. When the war finally ended, Patton would look back at the open roads and see not missed opportunities, but unfinished business. The war he had trained for, the war he believed in, the war he knew how to fight, had ended before he was allowed to finish it. History would remember him as aggressive, reckless, difficult. But what history rarely admits is this: Patton wasn't stopped because he failed. He was stopped because he succeeded too quickly. He won battles faster than the alliance could absorb. He collapsed Germany faster than politics could adjust. He forced decisions before leaders were ready to make them, and that made him dangerous, not to the enemy, but to the future. When the war in Europe finally ended, the map looked orderly. Borders were defined. Occupation zones were respected. Allies stood where they were expected to stand. It looked like control. But order is not the same as inevitability. It is often the result of restraint, and restraint always carries a cost. Patton's war was a war of momentum. Eisenhower's war was a war of management. One sought collapse, the other sought stability. Both were necessary, but they were never compatible. Patton could have gone farther. That is no longer debated. The question is whether the world was ready for where he would have taken it. In the end, Germany was defeated, but the peace that followed was shaped not by speed, but by where speed was allowed to stop. The war was won on the battlefield. The future was decided at the moment momentum was restrained. And George Patton, the general who lived by speed, was remembered not for where he was stopped, but for how fast he forced history to confront itself. He didn't lose Eisenhower's war, he simply fought a different one.